Well, look, it's 1 minute past, so I'll kick off and others can just jump on as they need to. So yeah, as I said, I might just try to address some general themes first, because the questions that have been coming through do have similar themes. So the wage subsidy is a big one. So hopefully you're all familiar with the requirements of that now, but just to recap, if you've got a 30% decline in actual or predicted revenue, then then you will qualify, and the intention of that subsidy is to keep people employed. So I've had questions where people have said, oh well, we're only going to look at that once we start making cuts, or we have to reduce, or we can't have people working. But the whole purpose of the wage subsidy is to enable you to keep working. So we've got different people in different situations. Everyone's slightly different. Some, can't do any work. Others are able to have some or all staff working remotely. Others are essential services, but they seem to be having a decline in work as well, because many of their customers cannot operate. So it's affecting a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and so that wage subsidy is supposed to be there to assist people to continue to employ staff. And because of that, it's got a number of declarations, and many of you will already have applied for it and will have seen that those requirements seem to be sort of being frequently refined over the days. A day is a long time in COVID world. I'm sure you've noticed where things just change so rapidly and you're having to make quick decisions, and then the next day the situation's slightly different. So when you're making those declarations for your wage subsidy, you need to be agreeing that you're going to retain your staff for the period that you're receiving the subsidy, and use best endeavours to pay 80% of their salary. Now, there have been clarifications that if you are not able to do that, that you have to at least pass on the wage subsidy. And further clarification, because we had lots of quirky examples where if the person doesn't normally earn as much as the wage subsidy, and that's particularly the case where we've got quite a few part-time workers, then you only need to pay them the amount that they would ordinarily earn. So that has clarified a few of the real curly issues. We were really having to just use best judgment and experience in terms of employment law to be able to work out what we were doing there. So that means that if you are shut down and you can't operate, and you can't pay 80%, at least you can pass on the subsidy. And there seems to be this general expectation from the government that employers will hold on to their staff at least for that period. They're trying to get people to do that. So we shifted from the discussions that we were having just prior to the lockdown, which were a lot about redundancies, to, well, at least let's hold on to staff. We've made this declaration, we'll pay the subsidy, and at least give breathing space to them make the decisions about the next steps. What I recommend that people are doing at the moment is that they are working out what next. How long can we continue to pay people if we are? What are our long-term requirements, and are we going to have to make some cuts? And then moving on from that, remembering, of course, that there are processes involved with all of those steps. So a lot of people have asked me questions around whether they can reduce hours, reduce pay, or scenarios where they have no work for their workers. And then, as I said before, we've got the sort of reverse issue where essential services seem to get the best, or perhaps the worst, of both worlds, and that they have those same problems in part, but then also have the problems where staff don't want to come to work or feel that they shouldn't come to work, and that might be even including a situation where they or a family member are immune compromised. So when we're trying to look at these issues around reduction of pay, reduction or change of payment or hours, we need to go through a consultation process with staff. So we've been doing a very sort of swift process. It's really important that you do still consult with staff, especially after the lockdown. We couldn't do anything about the fact that there was a lockdown and that no one was allowed to do certain things, including, you know, having to stay in your own bubble. But what we can consult on is what the impact of that is on people's employment and how they're going to be paid. And around those issues, we were truncating some of the time frames and doing it as a fairly efficient process, but still making sure we've ticked all the requirements that we have there. And I mean, certainly employment law and the obligations have not been suspended or put on hold. So we do need to make sure that we're meeting those requirements. So around that sort of lockdown, we've been doing that type of thing. And then we're now into a bit more of sort of long-term, what are we going to be doing for the next period of time? And how is that going to impact and sort of gearing up for consultation on that level as well. So we've had quite a few questions. So one person has asked, and I guess on these questions, some people have asked some quite specific questions, and I just need to be careful about that in terms of your privacy. So it may be that I slightly rephrase what you say or only answer part, because I'm just trying to make sure that you don't get identified to others. It wouldn't be appropriate to do that. One person asked if they wanted to reduce staff salaries to 80%, what notice would they need to give? So that's going to depend on what's in your employment agreement. For those that have a clause that addresses pandemics, that helps us to deal with reduction of hours. Certainly ones that we have drafted provide for the ability to suspend your workers' services for a period of time, as well as your obligations to make payment to them. And so we would be relying on those clauses to reduce staff salaries in this circumstance. Where people don't have those clauses, there's still ways that we can work around to go into a consultation process to address that. In terms of the actual notice, that will be as prescribed in the employment agreement. If we go back to the pandemic clauses that we've drafted, we, in terms of notice, we haven't required any particular period of notice, but it will once again depend on what your employment agreement says. So that's an important tool to be looking at. Next question is about reducing staff numbers and what is the process or criteria that's needed. So that's going back to our consultation process that I talked about before. So that you need to identify what roles are surplus to requirements. You will need to be able to justify why you need to make them redundant as opposed to keeping them on the wage subsidy. The reality for a lot of businesses, unfortunately, is that once the lockdown is finished, whenever that is, things will not go back to how they were, either immediately and for some not at all. And so we really recommend that businesses are looking at that long-term impact, and so that will feed into that justification as to why somebody would need to be made redundant as opposed to be just kept on the books on the wage subsidy. And in terms of a process there, you need to put it in writing in terms of a proposal, receive their feedback before you go ahead and make a decision. So you need to allow that time for that process to occur. I've got people, wanting to make changes to salary basically yesterday, and things have been moving very quickly and people have been put in this position in a difficult way, but we do need to get that consultation in about that. One person has asked about what they've called vulnerable employees. So really, I think what they're getting at is the group that's been categorised in terms of COVID as being exposed to it, you know, they're over 70s, the immune compromised, or perhaps even it could be people who are living with someone who is like that, when they work in an essential service, and they're saying they can't go to work and can't get a subsidy, and so they can't afford to be on unpaid leave. So first of all, I would say stop and consider whether the wage subsidy might apply, because if even some, well, I think probably all essential services I've dealt with, supermarkets might be different, but they do tend to be experiencing a downturn even if you can operate. So that would be the first thing I would say. And if not, you're really going to deal with it as if you don't have the COVID situation. So really, it's going to depend on what they're entitled to. If they are sick themselves, they can use their sick leave. You could agree that they use up their other entitlements, so maybe their annual leave, if they've got some. And there are situations, we've dealt with quite a few of them for essential services, where people are saying, oh, my partner is immune compromised, so I don't want to come to work. Well, I think it sounds harsh, but if the employer is providing work and they have put safeguards in appropriately to satisfy health and safety matters in terms of risk to that person, and that would include following government directives and industry best practice, and most industries are very on to what needs to be done to protect people. And if those things have been put in place, then if that person then doesn't come to work, they're choosing not to come to work. And I know that they won't feel like they're choosing not to come to work because they feel that they need to protect their family or whoever they're dealing with, but in legal terms, they're choosing not to come to work. And therefore the employer is not obliged to offer them any payment. Now, if a good faith step would be to see if there are alternative arrangements, but that might not render the same amount of payment. For example, the person might go on to some phone duties or something like that, but that may be a shorter hours than what they would normally work and things like that. So those are the types of things you're free to reach agreement, but there are limits to how far the employer has to go to in those circumstances. Someone's asked a question about using annual leave to top up 80%, and how to get staff acceptance, given that we're all stuck at home and people don't tend to have the devices to do that. There's a couple of points there that I could comment on. The bit about staff acceptance is quite easy to answer. So in terms of email, most people have that. An email reply agreeing would be satisfactory for all the various things that you might need to get employee signatures for. And then I would just follow up once we are out of lockdown to get the hard copy version signed properly. There are a couple of tools available. I mean, there's the good old photo on your phone and emailing it. That's usually satisfactory. There's a Microsoft Office Lens, which, and I'm not getting paid by anyone to say this, which turns a photo into a PDF that you can email, and also Adobe I think you can download that free from the internet, which means you can do some signing on that. So just from a practical point of view, those things can help.